Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to day 6 of our 30 for 30 little discussions. We're glad you could join us again today. Good morning, Penny.
Good morning.
Thought maybe we would start by doing a little book talk. What's on your radar, Penny?
Well, I chose 4 picture books that I absolutely love at the moment. The first one is Chicken in the Kitchen. And I chose these because Maisie loves them. So if I'm going to be reading to a kid, this one is a Nigerian author. And I just want to mention that the beautiful images, I always talk to teachers about how the meaning is portrayed in both words and images. So it was late at night, a noise had woken Anyago. She climbed out of bed and crept quietly toward the kitchen. But you know from the image that she's scared, right? That's not in the words, but the image is there. And I loved Katie Wood Ray's In Pictures and in Words because it talks about how important it is to draw attention to what's happening in the illustration. So that's book 1. Book 2 is called Hello, Little One. And this is called, subtitled, A Monarch Butterfly Story. I love a book that is informational, but also a story. And can I just say that author was one of my best friends in high school, Zeena Pliska. So that is just crazy to me. But I want to say that in this one, it's all about voice. Coming out of my egg, I see green. I crawl from green leaf to green leaf, eating and waiting for something other than these green leaves. Everything is green. See the little guy? And then when you turn the page, and then I see orange. Orange is gigantic, and I am so little. Hello, I call out. Orange swoops down, 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 graceful and beautiful wings catch the wind. Then orange soars up, up, up and away. Gorgeous. Book 3, this is Maisie's absolute favorite because Una is, as described on the flap, Big C's littlest mischief maker. And my granddaughter is a mischief maker. So she loves the way this book, I just bought 3 copies of it because we have 3 friends with brand new babies. Una was sweet and a little bit salty, like the ocean where she lived, right? It's just the perfect, hanging around with her friend, the otter. That's her little, like her little puppy. And lastly, We Are Water Protectors is one of the Book Love Foundation's summer book club choices for our elementary group. Caldecott Medal winner. This book is gorgeous, written by an Indigenous woman originally from Nebraska. Just look at these pictures.
Wow.
Oh, I just love every single page. I love the sound of it. Water is the first medicine. Nokomis told me, we come from water. It nourished us inside our mother's bodies. This whole kind of mystical, beautiful quality to this book. And what are you reading?
It is sort of the golden age of picture books, isn't it?
Oh, I have I think I was going to say I have about 20 over there on my window seat because I keep buying them. They're just so beautiful. I want to kind of sketch next to them.
So I'm still reading the book I mentioned yesterday, but I wanted to say what I'm going to be reading next. I haven't read it yet, but it's part of a small book club that you and I are in, right? And it's called American Harvest, nonfiction. It's about a family, a farm. And not having read it yet, I'm getting a sense it's really not just about a family farm. It's really about the division in our country. And it's about religion. It's about a lot of things. And this was recommended to us by a mutual friend of ours. And what I want to say is, I ran a faculty book club at Magnolia High School for, I think, 27 years. And I'll never forget a science teacher who's still a friend of mine. She joined the book club and then she quit the book club. And I asked her, why are you quitting? She goes, well, you keep picking books that I normally would not read. And for me, that's why I'm in a book club, is because I want people to pick books that I would not normally read, right? You're never finished learning how to read, right? I'm still learning how to read because, there's going to be challenges when other people pick something that I normally would not have picked. And so I love that aspect of being in a book club. And I know that as part of our classroom experiences, we always emphasize readers have plans, right? Our kids always kept next lists in their notebooks. What are you, because we're doing daily book talks. And if I say, hey, you might want to read this and it interests you, a kid in, March might write that down, but might not get to it until May, right? But the readers have plans. So that's my plan. I'm going to be reading American Harvest next.
As I will be as well. And I think that one of the things you said was really important, Kelly, that we never stop learning how to read. And I was thinking about one of the first books we read in this book club was Homeland Elegies, which really stretched me in that I had to stop myself. There was so much information delivered in such a succinct manner that I would read very fast like I normally do. And I'd be like, no, you need to slow down because he's delivering so much information in every line that I had to absorb it.
I think kids have the erroneous perception that reading comprehension is yes or no. You either understand something you read or you don't. And what I want my kids to recognize is that there's sort of a progression, right? You read the first paragraph of a book, you don't understand the book, right? And you read the second paragraph, you understand it a little bit more. How many times have you read a murder mystery in which you thought, oh, here's the killer over here, and then 3/4 of the way through the book, and I could talk about last night's episode of Game of Thrones, right? When there's a twist, right? I see that when they're coming in murder mysteries because I write a lot of murder mysteries. But if I'm reading something else, it's not yes or no. Comprehension is gradual, and it involves a wrestling match. And the more you're comfortable with that wrestling, the more likely it is that you can go read something that's not in your wheelhouse. I think Matt De La Pena talked to our classes about this last year, right? You start with books that speak to you, which is where a lot of our kids are because they're non-readers. We got to get books to them that speak to them. But then eventually we're hoping then that gives them the foundation and the confidence and the fluency that they can then kind of branch into books that are a little bit more challenging to them.
Mm-hmm. You're on fire today. So many important things there. I think about how we often put reading on a good, bad binary when we're first early readers. Like, I don't like that. That's not, kids do that a lot. And it's not like that. It's more like there is something to love in this book, but you're having a hard time accessing it. And I'm so struck by how the context around it is important, and teachers work really hard to build that. But I mentioned to you that I'm watching Dickinson on Apple TV, and I am absolutely 100% in. They use modern music. I have reimagined Amherst, and everyone who lives in New England's been to Amherst and seen her father's house where she lived, and it looks exactly like that in this film. And the grounds are very, provincial, but the characters are very modern. So that whole spin, I am now rereading collections. I have the Envelope Poems, that beautiful collection that came out, and I'm rereading her poetry with this very different view of who she was as a young woman. And Pat watched an episode with me last night, the engineer who hates poetry, and was like, this is really interesting, right? Like, they're taking creative license with a story and a persona that we don't know enough about, but it's allowing me a new way into the book. And I think that's a really important lesson, that you're never quite finished with X. How many Shakespearean plays have we seen over time where I have been upended in what I thought the play was? I remember in Ashland, Oregon, seeing Romeo and Juliet done in the 50s, and it really changed the way I saw the play. So I just love that reading never, ever is done.
Yeah, it's never done. And, that's just why I think it's a real concern when we talk about reading levels, right? Because I'm a reader. I don't have a reading level. I have various reading levels. If you hand me an electrical engineering guide, my reading level is very different than if you hand me a book on baseball, right? And that gets into prior knowledge and background. It gets into motivation. It gets into how developed is your reading tree, right? Because if you read about Dickinson and then all of a sudden now you're thinking Shakespeare, and now you're watching Shakespeare, and so now Shakespeare, you're gonna, it's that growth. I talked about that in deeper reading. I think it's that growth. I actually traced my interest in reading books on Vietnam backwards to how did I get there? Right. And I think that's an interesting thing, to talk to kids about is what's your reading tree? Instead of a family tree, what's your reading tree?
Yeah, that is I like the image of that because I always have my students do the ladders, like where does it get hard for you, and to identify that and rethink that throughout the year. But I also like the idea that the roots, because if you think of a tree, they grow and they're tangled together. And so my love of Shakespeare might lead me to Sarah Kay poetry, or you know what I mean? There's a intersection that we can't quite predict that would be really illuminating and interesting.
And the more that tree grows, the more able you are to live with ambiguity.
Mhm.
The more able you are to not freak out when it gets hard. And the more able you are to embrace confusion, if we might quote our friend Sheridan Blau,
Mhm.
right? That we want readers who embrace confusion, and of course, can rely on other things they've read to try to make sense of what they're currently reading.
Well, and think about the fact that if I stumble with a book, I don't instantly think I'm not a good reader. I notice that I'm stumbling and start using strategies I've learned, but so many of our students have come to believe they're not good readers. They either don't like it or I'm not good at it as a
Right.
permanent state of being instead of
Right.
this text is giving you trouble. Let's figure out what it is and why.
Right. So, yeah, there's two thoughts that come to mind. That brings us back to reading it. Either you get it or you don't get it, which is wrong, which is what kids think. I'm not a good reader. It comes back into that learned helplessness, right? But a couple exercises I might do with kids with that is I might read the first paragraph with them and say, okay, tell me all the things you already do not understand.
Mhm.
Right. And then, and then with 1984, because that book is so confusing, right? When we read that, the first line of the book was the clocks were bright when the clock struck 13, or, some weird line that starts the book. And our kids are like, what? And so we play 20 questions, read chapter 1, write down 20 things you do not understand. And then as you go through the rest of the book, you stop at various points. Well, now how many can you answer? And now how many can you answer? And by the end of the book, they can answer all 20 of them. And it teaches young readers that confusion is intentional. Like it brings a richness. It's not something we should run away from. It's something we should covet, because confusion is, as Sheridan says, is the place where learning occurs. Right. And so to get kids comfortable with that notion that it's not all or nothing. I love when kids come together in small groups and say, share one thing you're confused about. And they have those conversations, because it's giving them those tools to live with that ambiguity later. Right.
I was really struck as you were talking, though, that opening up a book you've never read and doing that live in front of kids, which I did every year. I'm going to just read the first paragraph and tell you, I don't know who this is. I don't know if this person's important. I don't even know where this place is. I don't know very much. Kind of modeling for them that normal confusion. But I also did it once with the first chapter of Pride and Prejudice. I was book talking Jane Austen. I had a bunch of seniors who were really interested in classic literature. And I said, a single man in possession of a great fortune must be in want of a wife. How many books begin with a claim like that? She's saying this is a universal truth. You can object, but she's basically telling you this is the book. I'm in charge. I'm telling you.
So I think there's two things, and I know you do this, but I think the idea of not only going, this confuses me, that confuses me, but also modeling what you're doing with that confusion.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Oh, I'm going to make a connection here. I know Jane Austen often writes about blah, and then, it just that to make that wrestling match visible for the kids. And I've said to my kids for years, there's only one reason I'm a better reader than most of you in this room. And that is because I've done it a whole lot more. And I don't even like the expression better reader, because I would say to them, you are better readers than I am on certain texts that I'm lost at. So there's this idea of who's a better reader. It's more about building those roots of yourself as a reader that allows for you to branch out, if I may extend the metaphor. Right. So when I hear a teacher in my book club say, well, I don't like to read this much fiction. I'm a science teacher. It tells me that the issue is not just with kids. the issues, with adult readers as well.
Well, I'll never forget when we instituted a reading break at our high school and the teachers all had small groups of kids to read with. And they would tell me again and again, I haven't read in years. I've read 7 books this year. And I can't tell you how often I bring that into my teaching. That idea of giving teachers and students, the whole building, time to read had an impact in every content area.
Yeah. I mean, what do kids need to be readers? They book, they need a time to read, and they need a place to read. Right. And for a lot of my students, the only place where those 3 things intersect is at school. Right. Some of them have time to read, but they live in a very crowded apartment. Some of them have a place to read, but they don't have time to read because they have to go and watch their little brothers and sisters. And so they need a book that they want to read. Right. And they need time and they need a place. And so this is another reason why you and I, when we wrote 180 Days, we argued vehemently the kid be doing some reading in school every year, and not just an English class. They should be reading across the content areas. We often cite that Mike Schmoker article where he says kids should be reading, and maybe we'll bring that up and share that tomorrow since we don't have it loaded up and ready to go. But they should be reading, or should be read to, at least an hour every single day in school. That's the volume of in-class reading. And I'll never forget the first time you told me this idea that if they're not reading with you, they are not reading without you. And so this, I think, has tremendous implications on allocation of time in the classroom and across the school day.
It's so funny that this is not what we planned to talk about, but we can tend to just kind of keep going with this idea. And now all of a sudden we're out of time pretty much for the thing we were going to talk about. Is that right?
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Penny and I, before we came on, we said, we had a guest that had to reschedule, and she'll be with us later. And so Penny and I, 10 minutes before we started recording this, we said, what do you want to talk about today? And we came up with a plan, which we'll now do tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. But in spinning out of the 2 book clubs, it just sort of opens up. And this is, I think, and I know it's a cliche, but I think this is why it's really, really important, I think, for professional teachers to have thought partners, right? To get out of your silo. And even in a high school where I taught, where the English department was fairly divided between sort of traditionalists and what I would say more progressive teachers, I, within that sphere, would still surround myself with 2 or 3 like-minded teachers and have these. I mean, it's very important. I mean, how long have we been at it? 128 years, and and still we're having these conversations where it spurs some thinking, right?
Sorry, that's hilarious. Though I do want to end by saying that one of the really important foundations for both of us is that we're working on 3 things with readers all the time. They're going to increase their volume, increase their complexity, and develop an allegiance to authors and genres. Not that we don't want them to have lots of experience with genres they don't really develop a love for and allegiance to, but that every kid should be able to say, I like books by this author. I like books that do this. They're fantasy, or they have a really fast moving plot. I don't like the slow character study. I think kids should be able to name their preferences. And if they can't, if it's just a general overall statement, I don't like reading, then we have a lot of work to do. What's more important than that?
Okay, since you opened that door, let's go a couple more minutes. And that's the idea of, we wrote about this a little bit in our book that's coming out in the fall. And that is that Jeff Wilhelm had this idea that kids develop writing identities, right? And I think that, we also believe the kids develop reading identities. Like, you have to see yourself as a reader. That means you talk to other people who like to read the same kind of books that you do. And it means that you have these conversations with other readers. And it also means you see yourself as a Sarah Kay fan or a Matt De La Pena fan, or I'm a reader of Harlan Coben, who I mentioned yesterday, that becomes part of your identity. as a reader? And how would our schools, maybe we'll end with this question, how would our schools change if the notion of developing a reading identity in kids really became, a top tier concern?
From preschool all the way through high school.
It would change allocation of time, change fun, change the way we approach reading in the classrooms.
It would. And it would also change the power dynamics that Bob and Kylene talk about in their new book, Forged by Reading. If literacy is power, I believe they're absolutely right about that. And we equip our students to be as powerful as they can be. How does that change the whole trajectory of what comes next?
Judith Kofer said, words are weapons and tools.
Yep.
They're weapons and tools in the modern world. And so, we have to think, explore ways. If kids aren't reading, they're not acquiring the weapons, and they're not acquiring the tools. So how do we approach reading with the idea of developing these reading identities in kids? There you go. How long was that? That was like 25 minutes of something we hadn't planned to talk about.
Chatting with you this morning, Kelly Gallagher. Bye, you guys. We will see you tomorrow.